the 19th of October, 1950, Chinese forces startled the international stage as they crossed the Yalu River into Korea to help the North Korean Communist regime fight off a United States and South Korean invasion. Chinese involvement in the war holds great significance in the modern day. If it was not for the Chinese backing their North Korean comrades, it is very likely a possibility that Korea would not be divided as it is today. However, their intervention resulted in appalling losses for the Chinese, suffering near 400,000 deaths. In this video, we'll be exploring what every historian has rattled their brains trying to figure out. Why did China sacrifice so many troops and efforts into joining this war in the first place? But first, we need to set the scene. Prior to the Second World War, Korea had been occupied by Japanese forces. That was until the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, which had led to the Japanese surrender in World War II. After this, US Colonel Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel III were tasked with dividing Korea into zones that would be occupied by the US and the Soviet Union. This led to the division of the country into the North and South across the 38th parallel division line. Fast forward until 1950, the North Korean Communist leader Kim Il-sung believed that South Korean military was weak and a North Korean invasion would be well received by majority of the South Korean population. Finally, on the 25th of June 1950, the North Korean Army, the KPA, crossed the 38th parallel and began artillery fire. In just 2 days, Seoul had fallen, and a North Korean victory seemed inevitable. However, feeling obliged to support the South Koreans, US industries shifted their focus to provide materials for the Korean War, and in August 1950, the US Congress gave consent for a $12 billion military intervention in Korea. The United States, along with United Nations forces, used a rollback strategy to push the North Koreans to the Chinese border. This brings us to the focus of the video. In October, China enters the war, and along with the North Korean Communist forces, pushed back opposing forces to the 38th parallel. Now, why did China enter the war? It's generally agreed upon that there were a range of factors that played a role. One of the reasons why Chinese leader Mao would have joined the war was a genuine fear that if South Korea was to win the war, a major United States ally would be sitting right on the Chinese border. Mao talked about his concerns of a United States victory a lot in a telegram he addressed to Stalin a few weeks before entering the war. According to historian analysis of the telegram, Mao thought the US wouldn't stop in Korea, but they would continue to, as he put it, run more rampant, and this would have negative effects on China's territorial security in the Far East. Mao suggested in the telegram how his aim was to drive the US out of Korea. Mao even recognizing that the United States might bomb Chinese cities in retaliation. Yet, Mao said it would all be worth the risk if they were to stop the US and South Korea from winning the war. Another popular belief was that China had entered the war because of Mao's desire to restore China's former glory. The Chinese name of the country derives from the popular belief that during imperial rule, China was known as the Middle Kingdom. The ancient Chinese belief was that they were situated in the center of Earth and were surrounded by barbarians. This belief, however, was stripped away from the Chinese as Western imperialism began to take over China during the 19th century and utilize their rich resources. As a result, many Chinese leaders such as Mao strongly wanted to restore China's status as a dominant power in Asia. They felt that winning a war in Korea would legitimize their status as a powerhouse nation on the international stage. Finally, one last reason why China might have entered the war was to repay the North Koreans for their help in China. From the beginning of the Korean War itself, Mao felt that if the North Koreans were to falter, that China had an obligation to come to their aid. During the Japanese invasion of China, as well as the Chinese Civil War, Several North Koreans had sacrificed their lives in fighting for the Chinese communists. The PRC's Foreign Affairs Ministry even stated how China had obligations to the Korean people who have stood on our side during the past decades. In the end, little can be conclusively said about what was the real reason why China had entered the war. All of the factors discussed in the video undoubtedly played a role in prompting China to enter the war. Yet, it's likely that the combination of these factors was what ultimately catalyzed the Chinese intervention in Korea. Nonetheless, it can be said that if it was not for this groundbreaking decision from the Chinese, the political dynamic in Asia may look vastly different than it does now. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you soon.